How do we know when a claim is true? And how do we know when the truth is true? These are all very complicated things that we need to have some kind of backing to prove, or at least enough information so that we can believe it. And that is where we use data. Data are usually a set of pieces of information that we all compile together so that we can have some level of certainty or some level of knowledge that we can make certain claims and believe them to be true. But the thing that makes this all complicated is that there's a lot of different kinds of data, and there's a lot of different kinds of information that can overlap, and certain types of data are better than others in certain situations. And that's what we're here to talk about. How do I know which kind of data I should use? The information that I will use to identify these certain scenarios or the phenomena that I'm observing through my experiments or whatever I might be doing. So let's talk about it. So what are the main kinds of data? We have qualitative data and quantitative data. Those are the main two. So let's start with quantitative. Quantitative means that it has something to do with numbers, or more importantly, with quantity. How much, how many. So for example, if I tell you that on a scale of, let's say, 1 to 10, that I'm feeling a 10 out of 10 today, that is a number that pretty much gives me some kind of objective identifier for how I'm feeling today. A better example perhaps could be something like height. Your height would be a piece of quantitative data. There's a specific number associated. For example, you could be 6'2", 5'2", 5'6". You could do it in centimeters. I'm 170 centimeters, 180 centimeters, so on and so forth. And that actually brings us to the two different kinds of data. You have continuous data, which means that any number could technically be correct within that set of data. So for example, height is a continuous piece of data. It is possible for you to be 171 centimeters, 171.5 centimeters, and so on and so forth. On the other hand of that, you have categorical quantitative data, where there's certain numbers that it actually doesn't really make sense for the piece of information you're getting. So for example, no one would say, oh, I'm grade 11.2. Oh yeah, I'm grade 12.5. There are specific numbers that make sense to that piece of data. So I'm grade 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, or 12. So that's what it means to have categorical quantitative data. Qualitative data, what does that mean? Qualitative data typically is in writing and include things that are descriptive and are trying to explain something. Now, qualitative data can be numerical still, but it's not that the numbers are qualitative. It is that the numbers represent something qualitative. For example, if I'm doing a study and I have males and females as a part of my study, then I can assign all males the number 0 and all females the number 1. And now I have zeros and ones. Yes, they're technically numbers, but this is still qualitative data because those numbers represent something that is descriptive. Now, something about qualitative data is that because it is descriptive, it can also sometimes be seen as subjective because you are describing how someone might feel in a particular situation or what their beliefs are. But we're going to get to the pros and cons in a second here. So what are the similarities between both pieces of data? Well, there are some very important ones, which include the fact that you need to have a robust experimental process if you want to do a good job with the data and have it actually believable. So those include things like making sure your data is reproducible, or at least the methods are reproducible such that you get similar data. You also want to make sure that your study is absent of bias, because bias will introduce things that perhaps makes your data not as believable. And of course, data is used in either case, quantitative or qualitative, to describe things. You want to identify what's going on, you want to describe the situation, you want to give proof to a particular claim you might have. Either kind of data can do both of those things. Now let's get into something a little bit more complicated. You can also take this a step further and categorize, instead of qualitative versus quantitative, and instead say primary versus secondary. So primary data is when you are collecting it yourself. You are the researcher. You are the person going out and you're doing a survey. Maybe you're doing an experiment and you're collecting data from whatever you're doing. That's primary. Secondary is when you are collecting data that already exists, but you're the one organizing it. So an example of secondary would be something like taking hospital records of patients, with their permission, of course, because of ethics, but taking those patient records from the past and compiling all of them and reanalyzing that patient history and say, oh, all the people who had diabetes also happen to have this other medical condition. And maybe you can gain or garner new information out of that kind of insight. But you yourself did not gather the data already existed, and you're just putting it together and reorganizing it. Now, to take this a step further, there's something called metadata. And what metadata means is when you have data about your data. So let's try and break this down. When you create data about your data, you can also kind of think of it as subcategorization or having different kinds of groupings of your data. So let's say I did a survey, and my survey was administered to everybody. And I also, in my survey, I was asking pretty much what kinds of ice cream flavors they would buy. And I didn't just ask them that one question. I also asked them what their age was, and I also asked them what their hometown was. Now I have data about my data, or subgroups or subcategorization, because now I can take the whole set of data, all of the favorite ice cream flavors of all the people, and I can say, I would like to have data about my data. I'd like metadata about every single person over the age of 18 to see what their favorite ice cream flavors are. And now I have this subgrouping where it might be different from what people under the age of 18 might have said their favorite ice cream flavor was. So that's what metadata means. Finally, let's get to pros and cons, because sometimes it might be difficult to know when to use what. So the pros of quantitative data, using the numbers, is that typically it bodes quite well to try and prove something. So if I told you, most people really like chocolate flavored ice cream, you would say, thanks for that piece of information. But if I came in with a very clear number, 70% of people like chocolate ice cream, that just seems a little bit more firm. People like to have statistics to back things up, and that's why quantitative data very often can be used in a way to strengthen your claims. Now, the problem is if you are going to introduce bias or introduce some level of meddling with getting those numbers, then that's when numbers should not always be trusted, because people can manipulate data, even if it is quantitative, all the time. So it's very important to be vigilant about how that data were collected. Now, one of the big cons, though, about quantitative data is that it doesn't really give a bigger picture. So let's take another example. If I told everybody to tell me their favorite flavor of ice cream, and I get percentages, okay, 30% of people like vanilla, 30% of people like chocolate, and the remaining 40% of people like strawberry ice cream. Now I just know which ice cream flavors people like. I don't know why. I don't know if they have a personal experience with it. I don't know if they have a very deep reason for that, or maybe they have no reason at all. But those kinds of backgrounds cannot be ascertained with quantitative data alone. And that's one of the pros of qualitative data, because now, in addition to getting that percentage or a strict number, now I can ask, why do you like that ice cream? And now I can get some descriptive words or descriptive data that show me, I like this flavor of ice cream because it is super yummy. Sure, if that is a reason that the person has, well, that's good for the researcher to know. And perhaps other people say, I like this flavor of ice cream because it is associated with very happy childhood memories. Also very good to know. And now we can explore a little bit more and a little bit deeper into the reasoning behind why people like certain ice cream flavors. Now, I know I'm talking about ice cream here, and although it is a very important topic, of course, there are many applications of using quantitative and qualitative data together to get a real big picture. And let's talk about voting statistics here. A lot of people look at voting statistics like polls and say, that's it, we have all the information we need, case closed. But that's not really what you want to get out of demographic polling data. So let me be clear. When we have data that shows 50% of people want candidate A and 50% of people want candidate B, well, now we don't really get any nuance. We don't get a lot of information. What we really want is to get the why. What are you looking for in a new candidate? What kinds of issues are you most worried about as a citizen of your country? All of those kinds of questions get a lot more information as a qualitative data than the quantitative could. But now we go to the cons of qualitative data, and that is it can sometimes be a little bit subjective, and the interpretation of the researcher might play a factor, and also the fact that it's kind of hard to say for sure that a particular piece of qualitative data makes sense for everybody. As in, I could interview 100 people about the most important issue of their country, and I might get 100 different responses. It's hard for me as a researcher to know what to do with that piece of information. Now I know that everyone's worried about other things and different things. Where do I go from there, right? So some of this data can be considered to be a little bit indirect to solving a particular problem, or also just simply because it is so up to interpretation, the researcher does have probably too much influence in the process of analyzing that data, and they can probably make that data look a little bit better or worse compared to what their original hypothesis was. So the bottom line is this: qualitative and quantitative data obviously have their pros and cons, but researchers need to be diligent and need to make sure that even if they're doing an objective analysis of their numbers, it's very important to be very open and honest about how they gathered the data and how they analyzed the data, so that people are able to make conclusions for themselves if that data actually supports the claim, and then as a result, if that claim is the truth and the truth that we can believe. Thanks for watching.